Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you. I'm Marie-Laure Salle, the Graduate Institute Director since last September. For those of you who haven't met me or seen me yet, I think that we should be together with Nathalie, who will join us, I think, anytime to open these sessions. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you, obviously, again, and still virtually. Hopefully one day we will be able to move from this virtual format at the Graduate Institute for this first Geneva Roundtable Symposium. Geneva Roundtable Symposium is a new initiative by the Graduate Institute alumni aiming to bring together distinguished alumni, faculty, and students to discuss critical topics of international scope. It's a pure coincidence that the symposium coincides with a critical event, critical rendezvous for global diplomacy and for topics of international scope, indeed, here in Geneva. As you know, the meeting between Putin and Biden is really just actually happening as we speak. They are meeting now as we speak. And it's, I think a kind of very symbolic event that we're having this symposium today on this very day. I would like to thank all our faculty members who are involved in discussing those issues today and tomorrow. Will be also involved in, analyzing, bringing forward a number of ideas that are actually very representative of what we do at the Institute. I would also obviously want to give a big thank you to Nathalie, who has given the full support to the organization of this event on behalf of the Graduate Institute Alumni Association. A big thank you to Brian, who is the father, let's say, put it that way, and the soul of this event and of this project. So a big thank you to you, Brian. Would like to thank the Graduate Institute Alumni Office, and particularly Karine, but also all the technical teams, which we don't see, but have been very busy and very busily involved in trying to and in making this event happen. And last but not least, a big thank you to all the panelists. I mentioned our faculty members already, but really all our panelists, alumni, faculty members, who have been able to mobilize themselves in this very busy period, particularly, at the Institute right now. As I said, the last week, we've been very, very involved around this Biden-Putin summit. So thank you very much, Cedric Thiel. Thank you very much, Andrea Bianchi. Thank you very much, Richard Baldwin and Siri Moon, who will, in order of apparition, will be representing the Institute over the following days. And a big thank you also to all our alumni. As you know, I think quite a number of you at least know that we've been going through at the Institute since I arrived through a collective self-reflection on our identity, on our future, on our strategy, and we have involved the alumni community. So that's why I'm saying that you probably know that. This has led to the affirmation of that identity, the formulation of a strategy that is fit for the peculiar challenges of our complex and uncertain world and its tendencies, one could even say, towards entropy, which we hope that the meeting today will maybe at least stall for a while. The way in which we project this redefinition of the Graduate Institute and of our identity has been laid out in the charter, in the new charter of the Institute, which normally you should all also have received. And this new charter, I'm very proud of all this collective work that was put behind and of the result, because this new charter is really both coherent with our own history, with our collective history, this history that actually, binds us all together, And when I mean the history of the Institute, I naturally mean the history of the two parent institute, HEI on the one hand and IUED on the other hand. And we have to allow for actually, in a sense, the hybridization of those two DNA, this double DNA, which has been at the heart of who we are today. So both coherent with our history and this double DNA, but also very relevant to contemporary challenges. So this was actually the objective of this work, is to create an identity and project a new charter and an associated strategy that would be doing the two things, that would actually anchor us in who we are historically, who we've been historically, but also make us very fit and very relevant to contemporary challenges. And I'm very happy to see that the spirit of the event that you've organized today and tomorrow is in fact quite aligned with our reframed identity and quite coherent with our common charter, because this charter of the Institute is, the way we projected it is really, in fact, a charter for the community of the Graduate Institute beyond the Institute in its more narrow sense. So what are the common points? One is an approach to complex problem that is at the same time open-minded, interdisciplinary, integrative, and inclusive. This is something that is quite clear from the project and the event of the next 2 days. And this is definitely something that is at the heart of our identity and that we have strongly reaffirmed. And also a common ultimate goal, championing a world of peace, which really was, as you very well know, at the heart of the birth of the HEI, one of the parent institutions of the Institute, to champion a world of peace together with the League of Nations and its birth, William Rapat being actually a father of both institutions. And being a champion of peace, champion of a world of peace is still what we project ourselves to be. And I think that this is something that connects us to the broader Graduate Institute community, therefore to our alumni. But today we have to realize that this means a certain number of particular things. And in particular, it means, and this is something we have strongly affirmed in our charter, that peace is actually impossible without a strong collective mobilization on and for a sustainable and more equitable and inclusive world. And by sustainability, we obviously understand all the questions around the environment, around natural resources, this is climate, etc. But we also very much understand, in fact, the social dimension of sustainability that is particularly connected with the question of inequalities and their social, economic, but also, as we know, and the meeting happening is also about that, happening in Geneva right now is also about that, the political and geopolitical consequences of inequalities. So for us, this broad notion of sustainability that includes a project for equity is really sine qua non conditions, are really sine qua non conditions for a world of peace. So they become, in fact, and therefore very central to the projection of the Graduate Institute in and for the coming years. And I was very happy to see this very strongly reflected in the project for tomorrow and today. I'm convinced that this new initiative will contribute to tightening the links between our alumni and the Graduate Institute. And this is also definitely one of my priorities for the coming years. I really want those links to be tighter. We need that. We need you. We, meaning the Institute, needs you. But I think it's also good for you to have an institute that will make you proud, that will make you actually very happy to say that you come from the Institute, even more happy than today. So I think that there's really a two-way street here in terms of this co-construction of a very strong and very powerful institute for the coming years. And we will, I can assure you that, of the energy and the willingness in the teams here, in the faculty teams, in the amongst the students, amongst our administrative staff, to really move towards an ever greater sense of pride for the Institute, for who we represent collectively, you and us. So, just a few words to wish you 2 great afternoons of discussion. I will unfortunately not be able to stay. I have quite a number of things today and tomorrow, but I'm very happy to be able to be here to introduce this event. Again, a big thank you to all of you whom I've mentioned, and to those I forgot to mention, and my apologies. I wish you great discussions for today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Laure. I think, unfortunately, we don't have Natalie online, so I suggest that we start with our first panel on international macroeconomics and finance. It will be a mapping. We will map the recovery from the 2020 pandemic shock, prospects for escaping the global liquidity trap. So now I give the floor to Professor Cédric Thiel and to Brian Bethune and Stefan Gerlach, our alumni. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Mrs. Director.
Thank you very much, Karine. Thank you, Marie-Laure, for the welcoming word, and for the Alumni Association for organizing this conference. So it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this first panel, where we'll be talking about international economics. And we are fortunate to have 2 very knowledgeable speakers. First is Brian Bethune, who is a professor of practice at Boston College and also at Tufts University, who has his PhD from the Institute, and he's been working as an economist in a broad range of private company spanning many industries. Our second speaker would be Stefan Gerlach, who is the chief economist at EFG Bank in Zurich. Stefan also holds a PhD from the Institute and has been working is in private sector now, but he also has extensive experience in policy institution and in academia. And closer to Geneva, is also one of the economists involved in the Swiss National Bank Observatory. So before turning the floor to Brian and Stefan, let me maybe share a few slides of introductory thoughts. So just give me a second to share that. So what I would like to do here is dealing with COVID and beyond from the point of view of economics. Okay. So let me start with this setting the stage by looking at how deep and uneven the recession has been. What you see here is a measure of GDP for various advanced economies starting in early 2018, and we set them to be all at the same level before the pandemic. What you can see are 2 things. Clearly, first, a very deep recession, and you see all this line going down. And second is a lot of heterogeneity. You can see that countries like the US or Switzerland experience both milder recession and faster recoveries. By contrast, the euro area and the UK have suffered more. And this is even more striking if we look beyond advanced economies. And this is what I do in this chart. So let me first explain what this chart represents. What I've done here is take the IMF forecast in October 2019, so before we get hit by the pandemic, and compare them with the forecasts that were released last April. The negative number, as you can expect, shows us that the IMF expects economic activity to be much lower now than they thought so before the pandemic. But what is interesting on this chart is to look at the magnitudes. The black line shows you advanced economies, corresponding to what we saw before, and we see a deep recession. But the IMF expects that by 2022 and later, we won't be back to where we would have been otherwise, but pretty close. Notice how different it is for emerging economies, the red line, where you have a deeper recession and the recovery is really lagging behind. These countries should remain 5% behind where they were supposed to be. And this is quite heterogeneous even within developing and emerging economies. China, the green dotted line, is not doing so bad. But on the other hand, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America and the Caribbean, these are the 2 lines at the bottom. So regions that are already poor and won't catch up after having experienced a very deep recession. So this brings us to the challenges. We have this heterogeneity. The country that's doing quite well is the United States, also China, And the talk there, if anything, not about recession, but about resurgence of inflation. So some people say this is just temporary, don't worry. Others say, no, this is here to last. What this may lead the Federal Reserve to do is to raise interest rates. This tightening of monetary policy will spill over to the rest of the world. There are extensive literature in academic publication about this so-called global financial cycle, which is driven among other things by US policy, and this impacts capital flows. And the dollar plays a particular role because it is a currency used worldwide, actually well beyond what the economic size of the US alone would suggest. So the concern one can see there is we may see a pullback of capital flows from emerging economies because interest rates and earnings increase in the US, and this could not come at the worst time. Debt have gone up in these countries. The growth is weak, and on top of that, they could face a sudden stop, so money pulling back. So the challenge we have in the global economy now is a very uneven pace of recovery, especially at the expense of emerging economy. And this heterogeneity and this inequality, I think, is also a longer-term picture. In the pandemic, poor countries and poorer segments of the population have suffered more, recover at a slower pace, and this raises question of where we will go from there. So with this introductory words, setting the stage, I'm now very happy to give the floor over to Brian, who will be telling us about the US and China. Brian, over to you. And we can hear you, Brian. You're on mute.
The famous mute button. Okay, so good morning to all of our colleagues, and thank you, Cedric. And thank you, Marie-Laure Salles, Director of the Institute, for those kind words of introduction. So I will proceed ahead and share my presentation. And we'll proceed with this share screen situation. And also a slideshow. So what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is start to look at the US economy in particular, and then I will switch over to China. So the idea is that I would cover kind of the big players in terms of what's going on in the international economy, and then Stefan will weigh in on inflation. So let's get started on the US economy. And what I'm showing you here is just a quick slide. It's the, what I call—
Brian, we're still stuck on your first slide, and it's not
really?
showing full screen.
Okay, it's still on full screen?
No, it's not on full screen. And
hold on. Okay, so I'm going to go to slightly different. Okay, how's that, Cedric?
yeah, that's good. And let's see if now if we can move to the next slide.
All right, are we okay?
Okay, perfect. Go ahead. Yeah. Thanks.
That's a little bit that's what's called a WebEx moment. So here we go. This first slide just looks at, is a quick snapshot of the US in terms of what we refer to now as the reality of the V-shaped recovery. You can see here, this is just a leading index for manufacturing. It's what's called the Purchasing Managers Index, which had been fluctuating in positive territory here between 50 and 55, and then this sharp decline in early 2020, and then a recovery and acceleration. So then in a nutshell, that tells the story for what's happened to the US economy. So let's look at the policies. Now, one of the things, the themes that we look at in this panel is the issue of what we would call the liquidity trap in economics, which basically means there's a lot of liquidity, but not a lot of spending. And one of the recipes for dealing with that particular situation is expansionary fiscal policy. And in the case of the US, there was a really impressive response in terms of fiscal policy, particularly in 2020, because we had 2 rounds here of legislative and emergency funding measures within a period of 2 months. That's close to miraculous when you think about how slow things actually move through Congress. So if you look at the main one, which was the main fiscal stimulus, which was passed in March and April, that was already over 2 trillion, 2.3 trillion, 2.4 trillion in 2020, and then another 0.5 trillion stimulus in 2021. Then there were 2 subsequent rounds of pandemic fiscal stimulus, rounds 2 and 3. There was a Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 and December 28, 2020, another 1.16 trillion in 2021, and another 0.7 trillion in 2022. So this was then followed by the American Rescue Plan Act just passed in March for another 1.8 trillion of spending. So we already in 2020, within the short space of 2 months, a massive amount of fiscal stimulus that was provided to the U.S. economy under round 1, and then again that reinforced by rounds 2 and 3 through early 2021. So this just captures what happens when there's that degree of fiscal stimulus, and all this is a measure of the United States general government deficit as a percent of GDP. So this is a measure of the deficit, and you can see when there's recession. So we've got 2 recessions mapped out here, the one in 2008, 2009, and the other in 2020. The green arrow basically refers to the stimulus that's injected into the economy by fiscal stimulus, and there are 2 components. One is just the automatic stabilizers which kick in, but there's also what we call specific legislative action. So back in 2008, 2009, you can see the green arrow. We had about 10 percentage points of stimulus all in. This time, we also had the last recession, in the pandemic recession, which was relatively short, only 4 months. We also had 10 percentage points of stimulus. However, you can see that happened in a very short period of time compared to 2008, 2009. The red arrow basically reflects the fact that while it's important to inject the fiscal stimulus when the economy is in a recession, you have to also plan for the recovery, at which time there will be a certain amount of fiscal drag. So the fiscal drag here back after the last recession lasted for about 2 to 3 years, and we're going to get some fiscal drag that's going to kick in 2022. Now, the next round 4 was just announced about a month ago, which is President Biden's proposed budget for fiscal 2022. So again, this is a fairly significant fiscal package, but it does spread things out over about 10 years. So it's nowhere near as large as rounds 1, 2, and 3 that were passed in 2020 and 2021. So there are spending measures, an increase of 5 trillion over 10 years, revenue, an increase of 3.6 trillion over 10 years. And the net deficit impact is 1.4 trillion, but again, that's over 10 years. That represents some degree of additional fiscal stimulus that could come on stream in 2022 and 2023. But again, right now we're looking at a potential, what we call bipartisan reality check, which basically says that this whole package is likely to be scaled back before it's passed. Now let's take a look at the Federal Reserve. Importantly, as I said, in a recession, the Federal Reserve has a considerable amount of power to do various kinds of stimulus. So again, what I do is I categorize the Federal Reserve's fiscal stimulus into three major functions: conventional monetary policy, supervisory and regulatory action, and then targeted special purpose vehicles. And again, you look at this, these policies by the Fed, they were launched very quickly. In other words, they were within the conventional monetary policy was already in place within a month. The supervisory and regulatory action took place in June and September. And the targeted special purpose vehicles, again, those ones were launched within a month. So it was, I call it a rapid machine gun-like action across these three crucial functions. Number one, or part A, is reducing interest rates to zero, quantitative easing on a large scale, and then what we call forward guidance on policies that lowered the entire yield curve. In terms of supervisory and regulatory action, there were 2 rounds of bank stress tests that were very intensive to make sure the banks were able to withstand the shocks without any problems. There was also some forbearance on some of the leverage ratio and special treatment of the what were called the PPP loans, the Paycheck Protection Program loans, and then the targeted special purpose vehicles for SPV vehicles that were revived from the Bernanke Fed, and then 4 new targeted SPVs. These charts just show that with all of those Fed programs, we had a massive increase in liquidity. So I call this, the title of this chart is Cranking Up the Liquidity Fire Hoses. What I call the 21st century of Bagot's dictum, which is in a crisis, flood the system with liquidity. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve did. This first chart shows the quantitative easing starting here, start of the recession, 3.4 trillion of additional purchases, quantitative easing, and then you can see this massive jump in the money supply, which was 14.7 trillion or 60% of GDP. So liquidity was flooded into the market. The other important point here with the US is that you look at this chart is that the red line shows that income, total income in the economy recovered much faster than output. Output is the blue line. So that's what I call the income output gap. Income recovered much faster than output. So we look at what we're now facing immediately is these supply chain constraints, and I call these the ABCDs of supply chain constraints in 2021. A is the forecast process breakdown in 2020, summarizing all those points. Basically, there was just a tremendous amount of negativity, pessimism. There was a conflation of an exogenous COVID-19 shock with endogenous shock elements that led to a lot of diversion or heterogeneity in terms of the outlook. So that was a problem in terms of the forecast process working well. Then there was the income output gap that I just measured. And now we have industry capacity and production constraints that are now popping up, obviously, on the radar screen. Semiconductors, surging demand, doing the product intensity. And guess what? Here we go, cryptocurrency mining. So not only is cryptocurrency mining putting a massive strain on power supply, but also on chip and graphic supply. Think about that. And then also shipping industry capacity constraints, which will be covered in panel 4 on June 17th. The other thing that obviously caused problems was a lot of protectionism, US tariffs, low content policies. And again, those will be covered on panel 3 on June, actually panel 2 on today on nationalism, panel 3 on local content regulations. So the recap here is that the US recap, the liquidity trap was short-lived. The recession ended in June 2020. And the conclusions, as I say here on the US outlook, right now the US economy is expanding at near double-digit rates. And despite these supply chain constraints, the US is doing well. I'll briefly just mention something on the acceleration in prices and Fed outlook. We are seeing an acceleration in inflation, but that can be traced to very specific components of the CPI where we've seen huge increases. We have the income recovery leading the output recovery. We've got supply chain bottlenecks and trade policy distortion. So 4 causal factors, the conclusion on prices, price adjustment process is necessary this year to clear specific markets and stimulate investment. And on the Federal Reserve is that our bet is that the Fed will bet that the price adjustment in 2021 is transitory. Even with that, we don't expect the Fed really to start looking at raising interest rates to the end of 2022. I'm just going to briefly mention China because I know time is constrained here, but China is in a category of its own. You can see here the same type of chart as what we saw with the US, a very sharp V-shaped recovery in terms of manufacturing, and also a V-shaped recovery in terms of services. Again, China following so it's similar pattern as the US, fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. You can see there was a fiscal stimulus package, which was around 4.7 percentage points of GDP. So it's about half the magnitude of the US. So there are various key spending and revenue measures included, and a lot of other public sector support, including through the policy banks. So if you look at the China, the general government deficit, same chart, we see this green arrow, which shows net stimulus of 5 percentage points. And then the red arrow shows that as we move forward, there's going to be a certain amount of fiscal drag. Again, like the US, the People's Bank of China used both conventional monetary policy and targeted measures. The conventional monetary policies were reducing interest rates, reducing the reserve ratio, and reduction of interest rate on excess reserves. And then targeted measures, which were similar to the SPVs in the US, reduction of borrowing range and expansion of credit facilities for key industries, expansion of policy bank credit lines to what are called micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and new instruments to support those micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. You can see a common theme here in terms of the V-shaped recovery. This is the initial decline in government bond yields, and then a recovery, which is the green line there. Importantly, what drove the Chinese recovery, this is probably the most important chart and in the entire slide presentation. As you can see, this orange arrow shows a deceleration in exports and imports over several years prior to the 2020 pandemic. And then literally exports exploded here with the green line. And a lot of those exports actually went to the EU. Again, part of the story of China was the Chinese currency actually appreciated. So the Chinese currency appreciated by about 10% in contrast to the US dollar, which depreciated by about 13%. So this is the V-shaped recovery in terms of GDP in China, which aligns with what Cedric showed you in his earlier his introductory presentation. So China, the recap, a super V recovery. It was only a 5-week contraction. Importantly, no recession in China. And then one of the important leading indicators, Tesla Shanghai. After a 5-week shutdown, they started shipping vehicles in early March 2020. So actually, this recovery was, I put in quotes, obvious by July 2020. And growth is tracking this year near 5.5%. They say the fiscal monetary response was also significant, but not nearly as large as the US. Exports were a key driver of the rebound. The yuan appreciated sharply. And this global shortage of semiconductors and computer chips is, I call it ambiguous impact because China is both a supplier and a demander of these components. And in terms of the production side, though, China auto production has been hit by the shortage of chips. Same situation in the US. Finally, the Super V recovery cements China as a global economic force. and the second largest industrialized economy after the US. China's in a category of its own, but is no longer a developing country or an emerging market. And this just shows you the share of global GDP, where I've got the US in blue, China in green, and the EU in red. You can see that China now is about the size of the EU in total GDP, and very shortly in the near future will exceed the EU and is converging towards the US in terms of the significance of its economy on a global scale. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was very interesting and a very rich set of facts for us to ponder over. So we ask you to unshare your screen.
Yeah.
And now we'll have a presentation by Stefan Gerlach. So I'm actually going to be managing the slides. So give me a second.
Well, while you do that, Cedric, let me just start by I'd like to thank Brian for having had this excellent idea of putting this thing together. It's really a great thing. This should have been done 20 years ago or something like that, but it's a really great initiative, and I hope this will continue in future years. So what I would like to do is to pick up on this issue that Cedric mentioned in the introduction when he introduced the session, and that is this issue on whether inflation is about to return. And if you swap slides there, so as Cedric mentioned, we have seen inflation sort of rising in a number of countries, and I have some data here I just picked 4 countries for the US, the Euro area, China, and Switzerland. I should say that these are OECD data and they end in April. There is a May data point for the US, and that is at 5%. This is a headline CPI inflation. So inflation has been picking up most notably in the US, but in a bunch of other countries. And the question, of course, is what should central banks do with this? As was mentioned earlier, the Federal Reserve is meeting today, and they will make an announcement. I think it's for 8:30 US time. Brian will tell us. And they will make an announcement what US policy will be. The SNB is meeting, also met today, I guess. I had an announcement earlier this morning. No, tomorrow. They will meet tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So how should the central bank react to this sort of pickup in inflation? One thing they could do is they could tighten monetary policy, but as Cedric mentioned, that's going to have a very big impact, not only on the US economy if it's the Fed that does it, but across the world, because particularly if the Fed does it, you have reactions in other countries and exchange rates and capital flows and so on and so forth. Particularly emerging countries are very much indebted, particularly in US dollars. So there's a very large spillover from monetary policy across borders. So a central bank tightening, if the big central banks that tighten monetary policy early, the Fed, the ECB, and so on and so forth, that could trigger very sharp reactions in the global economy, in financial markets, and so on and so forth. It could very easily plunge the world into another recession if things went poorly. So the key issue, I think, in the current juncture is this rise in inflation that we see simply a temporary phenomenon that central banks can disregard? Is it just an adjustment in the price level that's going to lead to inflation being high for 12 months, but in 12 months' time, as when you compute inflation over a year, these things drop out and inflation just falls back automatically to where it was before? Or is it the start of something more sinister, a more permanent increase in inflation? That's one issue. And of course, one particular issue here, which will help us get a handle on this, is to ask the question, is this a country-specific phenomenon, or is it actually a global phenomenon? So I would like to talk a little bit about this. I have 4 slides of graphs here, so I'm going to let me go on here to my second slide directly. So a number of observers have proposed what they see as an explanation of this. And this is a very common explanation if you read the German press, where people are, I think, hyperventilating about this explanation. And they say, oh, it's all obvious. It's all due to this mad zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing, and this very, very rapid expansion in central banks' balance sheets, or as you could also call them, as the monetary base. The monetary base is just the size of the central bank's balance sheet. So it's just central banks having just gone wild, and finally it's starting to channel through. And there's no lack of German, ostensibly serious senior German, retired German commentators saying that this will end very badly and we're in for a real burst in inflation. And to that end, I plotted here, I just downloaded data from the Fed because the Fed's database is so easy to access. So I plotted the monetary base here in the US, and I normalized the numbers. So the monetary base was 100. And now, yeah, so the monetary base was 100 in August 2008. That is the month before the Lehman Brothers went belly up. And I should say these are in logarithms, these numbers. So the log is normalized to 100. So we have about 150% or so, I think, increase here in the non-logged central bank Fed balance sheet. So the monetary base have exploded. But what we also see is that the so-called money multiplier, something that I was told a lot about when I was a student in Geneva some 40 years ago, the money multiplier has collapsed. That's the orange line. And actually it's pretty much the mirror image of what happened to the monetary base. So the money multiplier is the relationship between the amount of the monetary base, the size of the central bank's balance sheet. You can think of it as just the ratio of the outstanding money supply, here it's M2, to the central bank balance, to the Fed's balance sheet, or to the monetary base. And these are basically, the monetary base and the money multiplier have moved in different directions. It's very easy to see why this money multiplier would contract. So the money multiplier contracting essentially means that commercial banks are not so interested in lending out funds to firms or other financial institutions or to people. They rather put the funds with the central bank. And I think there are three obvious explanations here. One is, of course, that during the global financial crisis in 2008 and now also during COVID, banks it's very risky to lend out funds to firms or to other financial institutions because they could just go belly up and then you have a problem. So it's much safer to deposit the money with the Feds instead. Secondly, there have been regulatory changes that essentially say financial institutions need to hold some liquidity. And the best way to hold that liquidity is just to hold it with the Fed. In particular, as the Fed started to pay interest on these reserves in 2008 to 2009. So we see here that the money multiplier and monetary base, and they just mirror images of each other. And in the middle, powering along very slowly, is money growth. So here we can see that money growth here has been on average 7.5% since September 2008. And the monetary base has been growing on average by 17% per year. So I think one way to think about what has happened here, and the reason I think some of these German commentators in particular are a little bit off target, is simply that when the global financial crisis hit, there was a surge in the demand for liquidity. Brian has that in his slides. I don't know if he had time to mention it today, but it's in his slides. There was a surge in the demand for liquidity, and central banks accommodated that surge in the demand by supplying more monetary base. And so with the demand for monetary base picking up, you can just supply more monetary base. You can increase the size of your balance sheet without triggering any inflation. I think that's why we haven't seen any inflation. So I think there's sort of a very common explanation of that. This is due to massive money growth and so on and so forth. It's simply it doesn't match by the facts, and it doesn't match with the theories that I learned when I was a student in Geneva. So let's go to slide 3 here, and let's sort of drill in a little bit into inflation. I will come back to some of the things that Brian mentioned there, but just remember that we typically look at inflation over 12 months. So there are 2 reasons why this annual inflation rate can move. The first is that the new data is strong. The new monthly inflation rates are strong. And these are the blue pillars here in my graph at the bottom. So these are monthly inflation rates. And the other explanation is that when you calculate inflation over 12 months, when you move to a new month, the inflation rate 12 months ago drops out of the calculation. And that's what economists call the so-called base effect. and the sort of the dropping out effect. And those are the orange lines. And typically you expect the orange lines to be negative, or orange pillars there on the right-hand side to be negative. But as you can see in March and April, they were not. What happened was, and Brian touched on this, is that during COVID, there was a very strong downward pressure on inflation. Actually, the absolute price level in the US fell, and in a number of other countries as well. And then 12 months later, when this negative inflation rate drops out of the calculations of annual inflation, well, that makes the inflation rates shoot up. And that's why you can see in March and April, these orange pillars were very large and they were positive. They had the wrong sign. They actually pushed up the inflation rate. In May, that effect was much smaller. The second impact is that the monthly inflation rate, sort of the new data, if you like, that's coming into the calculation of the annual inflation rate, well, that data is pretty strong. So just to do a back of the envelope calculation here, if you want to maintain 2% inflation over a year, then every month you need to have 2 divided by 12, or something like 0.17% monthly inflation. But in February, the monthly inflation rate, the blue pillar, was 0.4, twice of what it ought to be. In March, it was 0.6, 3 times what it ought to be. In May, it was 0.8, 4 times what it ought to be. And in April, and in May, it was again 0.6, 3 times what it ought to be. So the incoming data are strong. Now, it's quite correct, as Brian points out, that a large chunk of this, certainly in April and May, exactly 1/3, is just one component in the CPI, and that is used cars and trucks. But even if you took that component out, it is clear that the blue pillar, the incoming data here, is a little strong. So we do have sort of, at least in the US data, we have a broad-based increase in inflation in recent months, on top of this effect that the negative inflation rates of the spring of 2020 are dropping out of the inflation calculation, and that pushes up the inflation rate. Now we can ask ourselves, well, is this a US specific phenomenon, or is this a global phenomenon? So what matters here is not whether inflation is picking up. We would have expected inflation to pick up across the world because of this base effect, because of the negative inflation rates that we saw in March and April last year in many, many countries. As they drop out, headline inflation will start to rise. So the question here is inflation rising more rapidly than you would have anticipated, given this sort of dropping out effect, or base effect, if you like? So one way to get a handle on that is to estimate one of those little time series models that at least I learned to estimate in Geneva. So I've estimated these up until starting in year 2000 on monthly data, ending at the end of last year. And then I make a forecast actually from February this year onwards. And since one always makes a forecast error, we need to sort of have some sense of how large that forecast error is. And if these graphs had been red, I would have referred to these as the rivers of blood, but they're blue, so I don't know what I should refer to them. They're called fan charts. And essentially, they characterize the amount of uncertainty that this forecast is associated with. And if you look at the US data, you can see here that the inflation rate seems to pick up faster than we would have anticipated. Actually, this blue confidence band only covers 80%, and if you calculate what the probabilities of observing the event that we've seen is actually 18%. So it's not really that firm evidence that there's been a shift in the inflation process, but it certainly makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that nothing has happened, it's just temporary, and so on and so forth. But if you look at the euro area in the upper right-hand corner, this looks pretty much smack on. China as well. The inflation is rising, as you would expect it to do, but not faster than you would expect it to do. Same thing in Switzerland. And I've been doing this sort of for a very large number of countries because, hey, I get paid to do this. And if you look across countries, you will see in the US you have this effect. You also have it in Brazil. You also have it in Mexico. You have it in Russia, but not in Turkey. So there are a few countries, 3 or 4 countries like that. But for every country you see an unexpectedly strong pickup in inflation, I could give you 2 or 3 for which it looks like completely normal. And I can give you 1 country for which the pickup in inflation looks too slow, and that's Japan. So let me just stop there. I hope I have triggered some questions and some remarks. So there's lots of concern that inflation is rising, and then central banks across in the world are just asleep at the wheel. And it's often argued that it's this expansion in central banks' balance sheets that is the culprit here. But I think of these expansions in central banks' balance sheets simply as a passive response to the surge in liquidity demand triggered by the global financial crisis and COVID. And it seems to me that inflation sort of now is high partially because prices fell in the last year, 12 months ago. And as these price falls are dropping out of the calculation of 12-month inflation rates just start to rise. But it's also true, as Brian mentioned here, that the incoming data are a little strong and there are some bottlenecks here and so on and so forth. I tend to think of these as price level effect that will just impact on the price level for a while. Impact on the price level permanently, but on the inflation rate only for a while. And if you look at the international data, then it doesn't really look like inflation is picking up unexpectedly strongly, except of course in the US, and of course most commentators are worried about the US. In the interest of time, I think I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stefan. That was very interesting. So we can now move to the discussion part of session. So for participants, if you want to put in question in the Q&A and the chat, and waiting for people to do that, I propose that we can comment on each other's presentation. One point I'd like to put to speakers. So we saw clearly that U.S. fiscal deficits have increased, and the U.S. is far from the only country. So public debt has gone much higher. At the same time, central banks' balance sheet are becoming very big, and so there is some discussion currently that maybe public debt is not such an issue, but also that we need to rethink how fiscal and monetary policy interact. It used to be that each was doing its own thing. I know people have argued that they should coordinate more, and I'd be curious to hear your view on whether you think this is the case. So if we need kind of a fundamental rethink of how we do policy, or if it's just a matter of adjusting the parameters. I don't know if Brian, if you want to start.
Yes, thank you, Cedric. That's an important observation, and just to recap, we saw that fiscal and monetary policy worked together in conjunction. There was a handshake there in 2020 that was very successful, okay, very successful. One of the concerns, of course, is the rise in the public debt. As you said, the fiscal policy has been used now very actively now for quite some time, so we never really backed out of the last fiscal expansion, and then in the early period of the previous administration, the deficits actually got larger. Now, so that systematic issue is a concern. What is kind of saving our bacon, if you want to call it right now, is that the Fed's balance sheet itself has expanded by 7 trillion. So if you look at total debt outstanding, 7 trillion of that is actually on the Fed's balance sheet. So that the actual public debt out there in the markets is much lower. So that's buffering that interaction. And then the question is, well, how long can the Fed sort of maintain an expanded balance sheet of that order of magnitude? And the answer is indefinitely. One of the advantages when the Fed steps in and takes risk out of the private markets, it then functions as a bank, a public bank, right? And so it earns a lot of interest because it's paying very low interest on reserves. So hence, in the last recession, the Fed was remitting 100 billion of profits to the Treasury over several years. And now we're going to see a repeat of that. So in effect, the Fed is operating as a very large public bank. It's earning a lot of profit. It doesn't have to hold any capital. And so that can potentially go on for several more years before we really see something. I don't see it as being problematic in the short term. And hence the total numbers that the Congressional Budget Office is reporting in terms of debt to GDP, which is approaching 100%. The reality is about 10% of it is held by the Fed. So it's really only 90% of GDP if you want to look at it that way. So I'll throw the the ball. I'll lob the ball over to Stefan on that and let him take a big spike at it.
So let me comment a little bit on the euro area, since Brian covered the US so well. I mean, I think we have a problem in Europe. If you go back to the European, to the global financial crisis, after the global financial crisis, we had a very expansionary fiscal policy, a very expansionary monetary policy, and then we had fiscal austerity. Now that was not, I mean, we know now that was not a winner. That was not helpful. The countries that had the most austerity, Greece, had a continuous increase in its debt to GDP ratio, even though it was bailed out at least once, and so on. So I mean, you don't want the government to dictate to the central bank, but of course they are dealing with the same problem, and it cannot be a recipe for career promotion among central bankers to argue that we should under no circumstances coordinate anything with the government. I mean, that is a mistake. I mean, if you think of the fiscal rules that we have in Europe, I mean, you know, they were cooked up by I was about to say, but they were cooked up by a number of men whose professional experiences in economics go back to the 1970s or so. And now the world has changed a lot. I mean, the world has changed a lot. I mean, the relationship between interest rates and growth has changed a lot. Interest rates are very low. There's been structural changes in the economy, the aging of the population, patati patata, that has tended to depress real interest rates. And it now looks like this relationship between the interest rate and the growth rate of the economy looks just much more favorable for borrowing now. And then it doesn't make any sense to have a fiscal rule that made good sense when the circumstances were very different, when central banks, when governments faced very high interest rates, relatively low growth rates, which was certainly the case in the 1970s and 1980s. So I would like to see a little bit more sort of, I wouldn't say a cooperation, but in fact, monetary and fiscal authorities, they deal with the same coin. And it doesn't make sense for them to try to sort of outdo each other. They should cooperate, and that's of course something that also implies in Switzerland here, right? The fact that there is this debt rule in Switzerland, I mean, this is one reason why I think it's. I would rather like to see more expansion of fiscal policy here, not so as to not overburden the SNB in much the same way as very tight fiscal policy in the euro area tended to overburden the ECB. So yeah, I think the times have changed. Let's change the rules of the game again as well. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a question from Q&A. We spoke about this possible rise in inflation, and usually we view this with concern. But the question is, well, wouldn't this be an opportunity to go back to conventional monetary policy and, you know, finally step back to the good old world of just moving interest rates without worrying about quantitative easing that we used to? So should we really be concerned about that, or would a few months of high numbers not be such a cause of worry?
Okay, I'd be happy to speak to that. Now, if you remember conventional monetary policy, when we were looking at the desirability of an inflation target, we basically thought 2% was a magic number. It was a silver bullet. Well, guess what? In the Eurozone, they achieved the 2% inflation in the, in the first 10 years of the Eurozone, but the entire banking system was in deep trouble, too much risk taking. So the 2% inflation target meant nothing in terms of addressing the next recession. When you think about the complexity of the economy now, so I just talked about the previous recession, which is, of course, the situation where we were sort of initially in conventional monetary policy, and then we had to go to the Bernanke Fed, which was the expansionary quantitative easing, and also 4 special purpose vehicles, as I mentioned. As we move into the complexity of what we're dealing with now, the pandemic shock, that really means we're facing different challenges. So that means that the Fed and central banks have to think outside the monetary box. And fortunately, they did. In other words, when you're faced with an exogenous pandemic shock, which has nothing to do with the dynamics of the economy, it was not an endogenous shock, then the Fed has to respond in a way that is unconventional. And as we'll see tomorrow with the panel on global health security, you know, we've had a series of these problems with pandemics. It's not the first one. We had SARS, we had MERS, now we got COVID-19. We're probably going to have another one. So we have to prepare for it and also be sure that our central bankers don't hide behind ideologies that put them in straitjackets in terms of responding to these shocks. I'll hand over to Stefan at this point.
Yeah, no, I agree. I see that our good friend Ken Jones, Professor Jones, asked the questions, and I think yes, the limits have changed, and I partially touched on that in that the relationship between R and G has changed, and related to this on this issue where the central banks should now sort of you know cut back here. I think not yet. If you take the Fed, for instance, so the Fed announced last year they changed framework. They would like to have the average inflation rate at 2%, so the inflation expectations land at 2%. And if you run inflation below 2% for a long while, well, you know what, people's expectations will adjust now. So, now the Fed has been criticized, and a number of central banks have been criticized for a very long time for being unable to raise inflation about 2%. Now they are talking, you know, they talk the talk, and so on and so forth. And now, suddenly inflation rates are going above 2%, and then people are criticizing them for letting inflation exceed 2%. As I see it, and this is my guess about what the Fed will do, but Brian will know better. I think the Fed will simply say, well, look, we have been arguing that we wanted to raise inflation rate for a while above 2%, and now it is above 2%, but the unemployment rate is still some distance away from the 4%, or I think Chair Powell said that 3.5% was to him full employment. So the unemployment rate is still too high. So why don't we just continue doing what we're doing, not change the stance of monetary policy at all? In particular, we want to demonstrate to the world that we have changed the framework, that we will react to inflation in different ways. So we cannot just react in the same way as we've always done. Now we need to signal to the rest of the world that, hey, the game has changed, we are behaving in different ways, and therefore we will take this. This is for us a golden opportunity to do nothing.
Can I respond to that for a second?
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Okay, now, agree, Stefan, and part of the really tricky part now for the Powell and the Fed is to walk the tightrope. In other words, just as Stefan mentioned, the unemployment rate is still well above full employment. We have 7.6 million US workers still out of jobs. So there still is an employment gap because the employment recovery lags the overall economic recovery. So there's that challenge. Meanwhile, we've got specific parts of the supply chain which are throwing up massive price increases, including, as Stefan mentioned, used cars. But also, guess what? For those of you who have tried to book an airline, huge increases in airline fees, huge increases in rental car prices. And so these relative price problems will have to play out. And now the Fed has to walk this very tight tightrope in terms of balancing, closing the employment gap and the problem of the supply chain constraints that are now emerging because of the shutdowns last year and the shortage of semiconductors, which, as I mentioned, is a lot to do with cryptocurrency mining. All right, and so I'll leave it at that.
So let me pursue on that. So we have a question starting saying like whether things could get started too fast or faster than we expect. And the first point on my chair is, as Stefan pointed out, the money multiplier has fallen in the 2008 crisis. But if we look at 2020, it has been actually stable. So the broad money aggregate has risen, and that's basically people leaving cash in the bank when they cannot go to restaurants, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, as we reopen, is there a risk that this money could be spent very fast, or Paul say that, well, now if the multiplier is actually still at a decent level, could we suddenly have a big appetite of banks to lend and the Fed may be running after that? So is there a risk of the Fed falling behind the curve?
Brian, speak.
Okay, so the question in terms of the liquidity, yeah, absolutely. There's a huge amount of liquidity, and as I mentioned, the recovery in income is well ahead of the recovery in output. So what does that mean? It means a pivot in terms of policy, that the Biden administration is currently on the pivot point of saying, well, wait, guess what? We forgot about the supply chain. So there's a supply chain task force that's being put together, and my recommendation is the Fed should be part of that task force, because remediating the production side is the #1 policy issue. We have to get production back up and deal with these supply chain problems as the #1 priority, handing off from the income supports. Very tricky, again, a tightrope in terms of changing the focus of policy, particularly in the United States, where there's been a huge amount of liquidity pumped in the system. I'll hand it over to you, Stefan.
So there's been a lot of forced saving over the last year, a lot of savings over the last year during COVID, and that's sort of stashed up in people's bank accounts. Now, what are they going to do with the money? Well, I mean, some of these funds will be used to actually raise future spending. Some of these funds are being used to pay down mortgage debt, credit card debt, car loans, and so on and so forth. And some of this will go on spending. Now, if you think of sort of current spending, what can you do? Well, you can buy durables. And in fact, durables consumption in the US, sales, durable goods has picked up like mad, right? Now, what about non-durables? Well, food, petrol for your car, and so on. Yeah, you wouldn't raise that very much. You might start, driving a bit more these days, and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of action there, but not pas grand-chose. And then how about services? Well, some services maybe pick up. You may, not being able to go on vacation. You may go on an extra week of vacation this year, or an extra 2 weeks of vacation even, and have some fancier dinners with your husband or wife or your partner. But you're not going to go and you're not going to say, I didn't have a haircut last year, so I'm going to have a haircut every 2 weeks this year. You're not going to say, well, I'm now going to have twice as much car insurance this year as I had last year. So many services are not going to pick up. So my suspicion is that we will see a little bit of increase in services, many durables, as we have seen, but I don't think this will lead to sort of a tsunami of cash going into consumption. So I wouldn't worry about this sort of fueling inflation. Cedric, there was a question from Liz Goldberg, which I flashed up on my screen, but I can't find it. So I was wondering if
I cannot see it.
Okay.
But we have, so maybe to take a last question. So the Q&A is, someone asked, what is the effect of the stimulus? So you showed, Stefan, that US inflation is a bit higher than expected, and Brian showed that there's a massive stimulus in the US, and there hasn't been other stimulus, or at least not as massive in many other countries. So is a particular performance of US inflation above expectations linked to the stimulus? And how are the countries that didn't have a stimulus, are they faced with an inflation risk?
Brian.
Okay, so one of the key issues, and Stefan mentioned this in his wonderful fan chart, which will make the Japanese happy. But if you compare the U.S. With China, the key difference is the U.S. dollar depreciated significantly, as I mentioned, 13%, whereas the yuan appreciated. So the difference in terms of the inflation performance can a large part be explained by the difference in the currency. So that's that part of it. Basically, I think that if you think the emerging countries, as Cedric mentioned at the beginning, this is a really important challenge in terms of trying to expand the benefits of the recovery. Extremely difficult problem because guess what? As Bart Brown will mention in the next session, the surge of nationalism has led to kind of me first. And that will work against trying to expand the recovery beyond just the US and China. We need to think of how to make this work for Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. It's very important. And I can see the Biden administration starting to address that by releasing more vaccines and that kind of thing, but it's only a beginning. Much more needs to be done on that.
I guess we're running out of time here, but let me just make a short intervention.
We have 2 minutes.
Yes. So I think it is true. I mean, the US here, they have just gone full tilt with fiscal policy and with monetary policy. And this is one reason why they're picking up a little bit.
Stefan, we're losing you.
Did we lose Stefan?
Yeah, I'm afraid we did it. Just Stefan was about to say something very interesting, and WebEx cut him off, I guess.
That's the WebEx moment, Cedric.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I'll let you wrap it up then.
Yeah, I think so. So we get time. So I guess we could spend much more time talking about this and many other kind of economic issues, but it is time now to bring this this panel to a conclusion. So thanks a lot, Brian and Stefan, if you can hear us, if WebEx allows you, for this very interesting topics. And we can now move to the next panel, who will be chaired by Andrea Bianchi on the topic of international law. So thanks a lot for your attention, and Karin and Andrea, over to you.
Thank you very much.
I think Andrea can take the floor directly. Yeah, please, Andrea,
yes,
go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored and very pleased to be chairing this panel on emerging challenges for global citizens in the framework of the Geneva Roundtable Symposium organized by the Graduate Institute Alumni Association. This is going to be the second disciplinary panel after the economics panel chaired by my colleague and friend Cedric Till. And the title for it is Two Burning Platforms Issues in International Law. And these two burning platforms issues are the threats of new nationalism and the issue raised by climate change and law in the law of the sea. And we have fortunate enough to have two great eminent panelists, alumni of this institution, Professor Burton Brown, Professor of Law at Chicago Kent College of Law, Illinois Institute of Technology. Hello, Brown. Thank you very much for being with us today. And Professor Charles Norkey, who's the Benjamin Thompson Professor of Law and the Director of the Center for Oceans and Coastal Law at the University of Maine School of Law. Hello, Charles. Thank you to you too. The idea is to have you both speak for about 20 minutes, and then we shall have a 15 minutes just about round of questions and answer, which I shall moderate. And if I may invite the audience, as you listen to the two panelists, if you have questions that come to mind, that spring to mind in listening to the two contributions, please, feel free to put a question in the chat. And I'll be happy to convey that at the end to our two panelists. I always find fascinating to realize, the accomplishments of our alumni and the professional trajectories that they have had in life and in their professions. And I take great pride in sharing the same sense of belonging to such a wonderful community. So it's with real pleasure that without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, to Professor Brown. Bertram, you have the floor.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, well, at first I'd like to thank the Graduate Institute, the faculty, the staff, and of course, Brian Bethune for putting together this panel. It's wonderful to be able to reconnect with the Institute and with so many dear friends from my time at the Institute. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Let me start by sharing my PowerPoint. Okay. All right, well, these are nationalistic times. I don't need to elaborate on that too much, but I think we're all aware of there are a number of charismatic autocratic leaders around the world. A lot of unilateral nationalist policies internally and externally. These are nationalistic times. I won't dwell on that. I think that's obvious. But with regard to the title, well, okay, I talk about threats of the new nationalism, but of course, nationalism is not new. Nationalism has been seen throughout history, of course, and I have a few examples on this slide. The German Empire led to the Protestant Reformation, undermined the Holy Roman Empire. Talk about nationalism in Europe, whether we're talking about Napoleon's representing nationalism and spreading nationalism. Of course, we have nationalism in Italy and Germany in World War I. So nationalism is nothing new, but we do see a new side of nationalism here in the early 21st century. And that's particularly troubling because we are in an era of unparalleled global interdependence and shared vulnerability. Now, nationalism is powerful stuff. It can be elemental, irresistible. Of course, there's no, and it's rather resistant to scientific analysis. And of course, there's no legal definition of nationalism. This is principally an international law panel, and I'm talking about nationalism, which isn't a typical focus of international law, but there has to be a way to assess the legal significance of the phenomenon of nationalism. And just a few exploratory remarks I'm giving here today. And of course, nationalism is seen as more a matter of psychology or politics than a matter of law. And perhaps that's one reason why there's no legal definition of it, but it is a potentially powerful motivator of human behavior rather than just an act subject to legal regulation or sanction. So normally we like to define a topic before we discuss it. That's a little bit difficult with nationalism, but I'll just a couple of examples from this psychoanalytic inquiry into nationalism published about 30 years ago. And it identifies two key elements: a tendency to view one's nation, people, or race as an enlarged and an extension of oneself, a tendency to distinguish as sharply as possible between the members of one's nation, people, or race, and other persons. Okay, well, that seems to correspond more or less to a common understanding. But in 1939, the UK Royal Institute defined nationalism. Of course, this is 1939, another age of nationalism, to be sure. And they defined it very broadly in such a sense that it included not just Adolf Hitler, but Mazzini, Gladstone, Woodrow Wilson, people who had visions of nations and a place of the nation in the international order. It wasn't necessarily an aberration, an abomination that we associate with Nazi Germany. And so this was very controversial because a lot of people, well, basically they're different schools. Those are those who stress the positive power of nationalism to unite as well as to divide. I mean, everyone knows it can have negative effects, but it can have positive effects. It can be used to consolidate a nation. That's not, of course, necessarily a bad thing, can be a very good thing. But others wanted to define the discussion of nationalism to, well, reject the idea that it is morally neutral and saw it as inherently equal. Well, this same issue, you can approach it in terms of a twofold division between civic and ethnic nationalism. Civic nationalism is this idea, it's a liberal, voluntaristic, universal, universalist, inclusive, the inclusive version of nationalism. And the example is, to be an American is not a matter of blood, is a matter of an idea, as one novelist, Robert Penn Warren, wrote. whereas ethnic nationalism is characterized by illiberal, ascriptive, particularist, exclusionary ideology. It's not based on blood and lineage, maybe common language and culture, not a community of choice. Well, you know, that's an interesting, that example shows that until recently, the US was seen as the best, perhaps the best example of a state based on a liberal civic nationalism. But of course, President Donald Trump, ex-President Donald Trump, rose to power by appealing to a narrower white ethnic nationalism, which until recently was confined to the fringes of US politics. Now, President Trump likes to use the word nationalist. He's proud of it. He says, yes, we have a quote here, I'm a nationalist. The word hasn't been used too much. Some people use it, but I'm very proud. I think it should be brought back. So he's been very assertive about being a nationalist. But we have a riposte, an intellectual riposte from French President Emmanuel Macron. There was a World War I ceremony and Trump was spouting a nationalism, and Macron felt obliged to say, well, patriotism is the opposite of nationalism. It's a betrayal of patriotism. It says our interests first, who cares about the others? So this is a debate being carried on at the highest levels. President Trump takes it so far as to suggest that globalism is an evil because it's somehow incompatible with what he would say is patriotism. So there's this quote. You know what a globalist is, right? A globalist is a person who wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. Well, it's astounding, the perspective. Let's focus for a minute, though, on nationalism and international law. So we know there's no agreed legal definition of nationalism, and that nationalism is a motivator of human behavior, not an act in itself, or an act subject to legal regulation. We do have the matter of hate speech, which I'll touch upon briefly later. And there's no specific international law of nationalism, although we'll see there is the law of self-determination. And of course, the general rules of international law apply to acts inspired by or motivated by nationalism. And so the whole of international law potentially can be related to nationalism. Just for a moment on the subject of hate speech, we have the International Human Rights Standard that says, well, propaganda for war shall be prohibited by law, and advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. This is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, of course, the US government has a reservation as to this rule because of our First Amendment freedom of speech. We have in the US a very broad notion of freedom of speech. I'm not criticizing that, but it's notable that the International Human Rights Standard requires prohibition of the advocacy of nationalist hatred, basically. This obviously the US is outside of this consensus, and that's worth noting. But well, what about self-determination? Well, this is the most fundamental international legal norm relating to nationalism. Of course, self-determination is more than a simple rule of international law. It's a peremptory norm of international law from which no derogation is permitted. But it is the most fundamental international legal norm relating to nationalism. Now, again, it's never mentioned that formulations of the right to self-determination never use the word nationalism. But it's clear that self-determination is about nationalism. And again, the form of nationalism that we saw most in the mid to late 20th century was this move towards self-determination, which is, again, a positive thing for the most part. Well, of course, again, I mentioned that the totality of international law applies to acts motivated by nationalist mindset, motivated by nationalism. And so the key, of course, the principal concept of responsibility under public international law is state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts. And so we have the codification of the draft articles on state responsibility. And Article 1 states the simple rule that every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. That, of course, from the famous Chorzów factory case. So insofar as nationalist sympathies may motivate states and or their organs or officials to violate binding international legal obligations, then nationalism, international law becomes relevant to nationalism. And under international law, a state is responsible for any internationally wrongful acts attributable to it. And most importantly, considerations of nationalism provide no special license. And it seems odd to mention that, but we'll talk about American exceptionalism later. Of course, recently, on the other side of the ledger from the resurgent nationalism, we've had the development of individual criminal responsibility for international crimes in the last 30 years or so. Tremendous progress has been made. And there's been all of the work done by the International Criminal Court and its predecessor tribunals. And we now know that expressions of nationalism may provide evidence of culpable intent, mens rea, for the prosecution of international crime. So so nationalism can have a lot to do with the prosecution of international crimes, in short. We have a whole more modern concept of the responsibility to protect, R2P, emerging from the World Summit outcome. And we have this statement here: each individual state has responsibility to protect its populations from so-called atrocity crimes. This entails the prevention of these crimes, including their incitement. So the responsibility to protect notes that governments have a duty to prevent and protect their populations from atrocity crimes. So prevention implies a duty to moderate the internal effects of nationalism before it can serve as a motivation for such crimes. So prevention, very important, and responsibility to protect, a new and evolving notion related to nationalism. Well, back in the 1960s, the late Professor Wolfgang Friedman foresaw the need for a shift from a state sovereignty-based international law coexistence, the basic framework 1648, in place since 1648, and what he saw coming in the future was a new international law cooperation. This was based on the idea that global interdependence brings an ever-increasing need for international cooperation to meet emerging global challenges. Well, to state the obvious, and we're talking about challenges, the challenge of nationalism. Nationalism complicates international cooperation in addressing all of the global challenges being discussed here today. Whether we're talking about recovery from macroeconomic shocks due to the pandemic, whether we're talking about climate change and the law of the seas, that Professor Norke will mention soon, whether we're talking about international trade and development, global health security. Well, these are all areas of tremendous interdependence where there's an imperative need for effective international cooperation. And that international cooperation is complicated, made more difficult by nationalism. And so it's highly relevant, even if it's behind the scenes and at a, shall we say, a psychological level. And of course, this pandemic we've all been dealing with illustrates that globalization and interdependence are at an all-time high. And that interdependence extends far beyond the health issues that are highlighted by the pandemic and extends to the matters the other panels are dealing with. And just to enlist a few more key areas: the human rights in general, the prevention of atrocity crimes, refugee affairs, and of course, the hot new topic of nationalism, cyber crimes. Because of course, they say that there's a cyber war going on in the background and something has to be done about it. And it sort of replaced nuclear prevention and nuclear deterrence with cyber deterrence. Well, of course, I've been talking about generally about the phenomenon of nationalism. One person asked me if I was going to have a case study in my remarks today, and I said, well, no, but to the extent that I have a case study, it is the United States and it is the Trump administration. But even before we get to the Trump administration, I like to talk about something that predates Trump, and that is the idea of American exceptionalism. The special form of nationalism is American exceptionalism, the argument that country should get special treatment and remain free from legal restraints because the U.S. needs to retain its freedom of action, not only for its own sake, but for the sake of the international community, since in many cases, only the U.S. has the power and the will to act when necessary. I'll tell you, as an American, when we have an American presidential election, you can't run for president in the United States without expressing your support for U.S. exceptionalism. It's an article of faith in U.S. politics that our leaders should feel that our country is exceptional. And of course, you know, everyone, I'm sure that most people from France or Switzerland or Germany think their country is exceptional too. But the form of American exceptionalism takes this a little bit different because if well, it's not just pride and a positive feeling about the country, but a license, in fact, that's assumed based on a so-called special status. So, you know, to quote former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, says, if we have to use force, it's because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We see tall and see further than other countries into the future, and we see the danger here to all of us. Well, you know, again, to state the obvious, of course, U.S. exceptionalism cannot be recognized by international law. It's inconsistent with, well, it's inconsistent with neutral principles, ethically untenable and inconsistent with the rule of law. But this perspective strongly influences U.S. policy, as exemplified by how powerful it was wielded as a powerful and effective argument against U.S. acceptance of the International Criminal Court. And again, that's one of the greatest achievements in terms of international institutions of the last several decades is the International Criminal Court, but the United States remains conspicuously outside of this project. And it's, well, it's unfortunate in my view, but of course, it's not illegal. There's no formal requirement for the United States to ratify the ICC statute, but it just shows the power of nationalism to, if you like, sabotage international cooperation. Well, President Donald Trump seemed to personify at least two troubling aspects of nationalism, one external and the other internal. On the one, he consistently denigrated and undermined international law and institutions from the World Trade Organization, where basically rendered the dispute cell, the appellate body almost left it unable to function by refusing to agree to the naming of new judges. NATO, which was completely undermined by his consistent expressions of skepticism about the U.S. commitment to the security of Europe. And of course, the WHO, from which the United States withdrew in the midst of a pandemic in a seemingly irrational policy. So he's been taking American exceptionalism to new extremes. And his 2019 decision to pardon 3 U.S. servicemen who had been convicted by U.S. military justice of war crimes. They'd been duly convicted, and President Trump decided to pardon them because he thought, you know, these are good war fighters, and we need more people like this. Some of them have been described as frightening in their disregard for human life, but he pardoned them anyway. That's a disturbing. By the way, that seems like an internal act, but that's an act of great external significance, because if you pardon someone who's committed war crimes, that sends a message about the commitment of the United States to international humanitarian law. And a very troubling message it is. Another more internal aspect of Trump's brand of nationalism is focused on incidents such as his insistent denial of former President Barack Obama's status as a U.S. citizen, so-called birtherism. Then there's his statement that Mexican immigrants were rapists and murderers, and his characterization of far-right protesters, including neo-Nazis, as fine people. And more recently, his suggestion that 4 U.S. congresswomen should go, well, here's the quote. This is an extended quote, but it's shocking that an American president could say such a thing. So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how it's done. Well, I should just point out that these women, these duly elected congresswomen aren't all born in other countries. Some were, but some are native-born Americans. But that's a detail, of course, that's irrelevant. But it does tell us the extent to which nationalism has infected the attitudes in the U.S. So Trump's unapologetic expression of nationalism appealed to the racial identity of the white majority in U.S. domestic politics in order to stoke racial division and polarization. The strategy is calculated to undermine the right status and security of minorities within the U.S. And of course, this raises fundamental issues of international human rights, or as we call them in this U.S., civil rights, but it's the same. Trump himself may soon be gone, or at least politically gone, but current efforts to legislate far greater voter suppression in the U.S. at the state level suggest that American democracy itself could be in peril. And of course, if we have the so-called exceptional power following such policies, it's particularly troubling, and of course, particularly troubling to me as an American. How do we meet the challenge of nationalism? How do we limit the damage? Well, Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski, the late Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski, who of course was Polish foreign minister and of course a noted international lawyer, identified three different ways to counteract nationalism. First, he said we need prevention of nationality-related military conflicts and the organization of international mechanisms serving this goal. Well, that sounds good. Easier said than done. Development of institutionalized cooperation, including regional and cross-border cooperation, and international guarantees for the protection of national minorities. Well, again, all of that sounds great, but of course, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that his prescription for nationalism is more international cooperation. That's a problem because nationalism itself may become the chief obstacle to international cooperation. It's kind of a chicken and the egg system. What comes first? Less nocive nationalism or greater and better international cooperation? It's a chicken and egg situation. It all comes down to whether the promise of international cooperation can appeal to the enlightened self-interest of nationalistic actors. Well, there can be no guarantee of success, but the effort is still worthwhile and fundamentally important. And well, these things may be cyclical. And of course, we do have a new US President, Joe Biden, who may usher in a less nationalistic era, at least in terms of US foreign policy. Well, and so to conclude my remarks, obviously nationalism is here to stay. I don't think it's going anywhere. But in this age of interdependence, it's more important than ever to moderate the rough edges of that nationalism. States have a primary responsibility for doing that. That's part of the R2P portfolio, of course, with the assistance of the international community. How great a role can international law play in the process? Well, at the best of times, international law, institutions, and principles can help to limit the destabilizing effects of nationalistic ideas, policies, and perspectives. But at other times, they struggle to restrain the aggressive impulses of bombastic nationalist leaders. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. You certainly provided us with much food for thought, and I look forward to going back to some of the issues you raised in the debate. But now let me turn to Charles Norkey, who's the next panelist, and who's going to speak about climate change and the law of the sea. Charles, you have the floor.
Hello, I'm trying to identify how to share a screen, and it's not quite working. Hang on a second.
Go share at the top
Share
in
at
the
the top.
application. Yeah. Upper left-hand corner.
Hang on. I have to get back to this again. Here we go. All right, share at the top.
Yeah.
Clementine, may I ask you to run the PowerPoint?
Yes, of course.
Clementine, are you able to run the PowerPoint?
Yes, I am doing it right now.
So thank you very much, again, Brian, for organizing this this roundtable. Somebody in a previous panel said we should have been doing this 20 years ago, and then he was right. So thanks for putting all of this work together. Thanks, Andrea, for being our faculty moderator, and thank you for taking the time to be here. Unfortunately, we never got to know you when we were students at HVE because you're probably younger than most of us. But I do want to say a quick note of appreciation and thanks to Professor Lucius Kauflich and Professor Avi Saab, two people that taught me, and Professor Kauflich taught me law of the sea for the very first time. And if I hadn't taken that course, this slide, which depicts Maine, would not be here. That is Maine. That's one of our lighthouses. And anyone who wishes to come and visit, I will buy you a lobster. It's a beautiful place to visit. Slide, please, Clementine. Clementine, slide. Thank you. Maine is also famous for this particular case that many of us in international law have studied, which is the delimitation of the maritime boundary of the Gulf of Maine area. This is something that I see outside my office window and outside my home. This Gulf of Maine area was delimited by a chamber of the International Court of Justice. We like to call it United States versus Canada, and those of us in the United States like to believe that we won. Next slide, please. But the Canadians differ. Where's Brian? Right. Slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to focus my remarks on the Arctic. The Arctic because when we think about climate change and climate change impacts, clearly visible in the Arctic, we happen to do quite a lot of work, my institution, in the Arctic with lawyers working with scientists, and we put them together in the field and we run courses together. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Arctic, if you look at these two slides, one is Antarctica and the other is the Arctic. Now, what is the difference? Well, of course, Antarctica is land surrounded by water, and the Arctic is water surrounded by land. It's an ocean. The other feature of Antarctica is that there's a treaty regime. One treaty which pretty well stabilizes expectations of parties working in Antarctica. It is very much science driven. The Arctic is messier. It's messier because the constitutive process includes the national legislation of the Arctic states. It includes various operational codes, such as the Polar Code, and of course the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, because it is, after all, an ocean. Next slide, please. If I can just touch on a couple of trends here, for those of you who don't spend much time in the Arctic, it is the world's fourth largest ocean. There are 8 Arctic states, but only 5 are actually littoral to the Arctic Ocean. For a long time, social interactions have been shaped and limited by geography, cold, darkness, and ice. And now we have a very different trend, moving from isolation to access. Climate change, including ice retreat, sea level rise, the physical contours of the environment no longer impose limitations on various human activities. We have geopolitical issues, maritime and land operational theater, NATO, Russia, and we have states that are participants, indigenous peoples, shipping firms, oil, gas, and mining companies, and so on. And within this small space, very much driven by climate change, we have intensifying demands for access and control. Next slide, please. Total ice loss. Have a look at this slide. So you see the graph over time since 1900, but the total ice loss, this is since 1979. So Bart, this is the year, and probably Brian, when we first arrived at the Graduate Institute. Since 1979, 656,000 square miles of ice loss. Clementine, next slide. Merci. So yes, it is going away. And those of you interested in delving into this a little bit more, a couple of colleagues and I, 2 scientists actually, and myself, have put together a website that discusses why climate change matters. And you can see the way to link to it at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. So the Arctic is a very complex place with all kinds of various interactions. And if you take in this slide with all of these activities for a moment, everything you see here is impacted by climate change. Next slide. I'm moving quickly because I want to leave time for Q&A. So before we can think about law in the Arctic, we need to think about the Arctic social process. The Arctic states and the peoples, including indigenous populations. Non-Arctic polar capable states, such as China. International and intergovernmental organizations. I'll touch on one of the latter momentarily. Universities and scientific societies. We are funded by much of our work by the National Science Foundation, which has a major Arctic presence, at least from the United States. Corporations, the mining, such as the Australian companies that are looking to mine in Greenland with Chinese backing. And so there's this question for the people of the Arctic and the rest of us who, in many respects, depend on what happens in the Arctic. Who gets what, when, and how? What are the goals? What do we value? What kind of strategies to achieve those goals, including the strategy of law? Law is one of the many strategies. How do you understand the conditions? And the changing Arctic conditions primarily have to do with climate change at the moment. Are there common interests among Arctic countries, non-Arctic countries, polar capable states, non-polar capable states that still suffer the effects of climate change? Next slide, please. And so, what law primarily is applicable in the Arctic? Well, it's this one. This conference, which was going on when a number of us were students at the Institute. Some of us had internships related to the conference. Our professor Kauflich was a member of the Swiss delegation. Next slide, please. Thank you, Clementine. So it's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that emerged from this conference that is most important within the Arctic. And what did it do? Next slide. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea set the maritime and marine zones, the kind of coastal state competencies in those zones, the competencies of international users, everything from territorial baselines, the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, which is the fisheries zone, the contiguous zone, which is a protection zone for the territorial sea for the coastal state, the continental shelf, very important, which has one fixed breadth with the possibility of an additional claim, and then the international waters, the high seas beyond national jurisdiction, and the area, the deep seabed below the high seas. Every one of these zones is potentially in play in the small place we call the Arctic and the Arctic Ocean. Next slide, please. So the continental shelf. It's worth thinking about the continental shelf because there are overlapping continental shelf claims in the Arctic. And the reason is this. If you see, under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a coastal state gets 200 nautical miles of continental shelf without doing anything. Next slide, Clementine. Good. So, no, go back. Perfect. So if you look at these red circles, the continental shelf by virtue of even what we call customary international law. Those of us who are international lawyers, this goes back to President Harry Truman, the Truman Proclamation, 200 nautical miles. If you do something, meaning if a coastal state can collect the evidence, present the scientific evidence, the Convention on the Continental Shelf, which sits in New York City at the Secretariat of the UN, you can claim up to an additional 150 nautical miles if the evidence supports the claim. Now, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf is not an adjudicative panel. It's not a court. It's not a tribunal. There's scientists who simply say this evidence supports an additional claim. Next slide. And something else to think about. This is water. Under a particular provision of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, coastal states can intensify their regulatory activities, their conservation activities, to protect ice-covered areas. Next slide. And then we have the exclusive economic zones of the various states. And you'll see in the middle, we have some high seas. We've got the Central Arctic Ocean. Next slide. So the Central Arctic Ocean is very important for fisheries. And the problem is, when you get beyond national jurisdiction of any particular state, how do you engage in fisheries conservation? And of course, fish do not obey maritime boundaries or the maritime zones, right? They move. So there are two efforts to regulate fishing or to prevent unregulated fishing in the high seas. There's an agreement specific to the Central Arctic Ocean, and making its way through the UN right now is an instrument that would protect the conservation of species beyond national jurisdiction. Still making its way through. Next slide. And then we can think about shipping. So these are the primary shipping lanes at the moment. One is the Northwest Passage. If you're Canadian, you believe these are the internal waters of your country. The United States and other countries take a different point of view, that they're international waters and international strait, rather. If you look at the Northern Sea Route running through Russian waters, these are the two primary routes at the moment. And then there's discussion about a future Central Sea Route that would go right over the top of the Arctic. But that again depends on sea ice projection. If you look at the bottom right-hand screen, that is the Crystal Serenity coming through the Northwest Passage. A tourist vessel, tourism. And one of the concerns is if something goes wrong, a large number of passengers on this vessel, how are they going to be rescued? So search and rescue is a big issue in the Arctic. Next slide, please. The Polar Code, spawned by the International Maritime Organization, is applicable to vessels operating in polar waters, so above 66 degrees north, and then in Antarctic waters as well. And the code requires additional strengthening of vessels, environmental protections for vessels to prevent oil spills, and new safety regulations. Next slide. Now, one thing the Polar Code does for ice-class ships is it makes them more expensive to operate, right? So the kind of vessel traffic that we're seeing in the Arctic is less transiting through the Arctic, it's more destination, including from Maine to Greenland and Iceland. There's an Icelandic shipping company that moves from Murmansk, Russia, Tromsø, Norway, Iceland to Maine and back up. But those vessels don't go through the Arctic. They're destination to the Arctic. Next slide, please. And one of the big issues for shipping in the Arctic is navigation, satellite navigation. There's just limited Arctic coverage right now. Now that's going to change if more satellites go up. But one reason that we are seeing less, or not a lot of shipping yet, is because of satellite navigation limitations. Next slide. I'd like to say a little something about an important intergovernmental organization, which is called the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council focuses pretty much on environmental regulation and environmental aspects of the Arctic. Its secretariat is in Tromsø, Norway, and it is comprised of the Arctic countries, permanent participants who are indigenous populations, and observer countries. And most of the work that's really done by the Arctic Council is done in working groups. Search and rescue, conservation of Arctic fauna and the marine environment, and so on. The new chair of the Arctic Council is Russia, so it's a 2-year rotating chair, and then the next chair after Russia will be the United States. Previous chair was Iceland. Next slide. These are the permanent participants of the Arctic Council. So the permanent participants of the Arctic Council are the indigenous population. So there's an indigenous Arctic. So we think of the Arctic states, but we have Inuit peoples, Sami peoples, and so on. And what's very interesting about the Arctic Council, it's an intergovernmental organization more than an international organization because of how it's constituted, is that indigenous groups do have a seat at the table. Next slide. I go through these fairly quickly. Search and rescue, very, very important. So one of the important agreements spawned by the Arctic Council is search and rescue responsibility. When that vessel is in trouble in the Northwest Passage or the Northern Sea Route, which governments will have responsibility to attend to that vessel? Next slide. There's an agreement on international scientific cooperation, something that's very important for those of us who are researchers doing work in the Arctic. This is inspired actually by the Antarctic Treaty, but this was produced again by the Arctic Council. Next slide. And then, of course, oil pollution preparedness and response. How and what states are going to mobilize to respond to oil pollution and economic disaster potentially. Next slide. So players in the Arctic, I mentioned that we have the 5 littoral states, the 5 states littoral to the Arctic, the 8 states that are not specifically littoral to the Arctic, and then polar capable states, the most important of which is China at the moment. China has more effectively working icebreakers than does the United States. They've got a major research station at Spitsbergen, Norway, and they're very, very determined to work in the Arctic and very capable at it. Next slide. We do quite a lot of work in Greenland, in southern Greenland primarily, meaning my university, and in collaboration with other scientists and lawyers and other universities. And something that people are thinking about right now, and maybe this relates a little bit to nationalism, Greenland wants independence. And there is an independence movement. And if Greenland achieves independence, Denmark is no longer an Arctic state. Denmark is no longer in the Arctic Council. If Greenland, I should say when Greenland, because it will happen, achieves independence, Greenland does not have to remain in NATO. The United States has a major air base in northern Greenland. NATO is very involved in northern Greenland. So that's up for grabs. Next slide. This is from my Canadian friends. This is the last territorial dispute in the Arctic. Hans Island. Hans Island, which is not much bigger than Iraq. It's not really an island. It is between Greenland and Canada. So in various weeks, the Canadians go and leave a bottle of Canadian Club, and then Danes will show up and leave a Canadian liqueur. Next slide. Is this going to go to dispute settlement? No, very unlikely. So it's unlikely to make its way to the International Tribunal of Law of the Sea, and definitely not the ICJ. By the way, I should say something quickly about the United States. and its adherence to the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Those of us who were in Geneva when the Convention on Law of the Sea was being negotiated, some of us had the honor of meeting Ambassador Elliot Richardson, who was leading the American delegation appointed by Nixon. The United States has never ratified the convention. However, the position of the legal advisor of the Department of State is that the United States abides by those provisions of the convention which reflect customary international law. So do you remember that slide I showed you about the continental shelf? The United States has major research vessels collecting evidence to present to the Commission on Limits of the Continental Shelf to make a claim. And then here's a question: can a non-state party make a claim to an extended continental shelf? And that question is still out there. Next slide, and this is the last slide. So back to climate change. It affects a lot, and more than we could get into in this short presentation. It affects ice and more. It can generate impacts upon baselines, upon a legal characterization of marine maritime features, islands, rocks. Islands, there would be entitlements. Maritime boundaries. Maritime boundaries can shift as coastlines change. And then how will those of us in the international law community, those of us who are scholars of the law of the sea, respond to it? One idea is this legal fiction of permanency, right? That the baselines, no matter what happens with nature and climate change, that the baselines that were fixed remain fixed. That's one possibility. Next slide. Thank you, and that is my email address if anyone wants to get in touch. And that is a picture from England. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you very much once again, Bertram, for your presentations. We don't have much time, but I just wanted to solicit your view on a couple of general questions that I think are of interest to the public at large and to our audience. And that is, international has often been presented as a discipline of crisis. So as an instrument to deal with things that go deeply wrong. And I wonder to the extent to which that affects also our way of using and thinking of international law. We do have high expectations about international law, progressing the wrongs of these worlds, trying to bring about justice and, redress the injustices, the social inequalities, etc., etc. What's your view about this way of thinking of international law as always dealing with burning platform issues, with crisis, with things that go deeply wrong? Isn't that a way psychologically also to undermine the capacity of international law to present itself as an effective way of dealing with real life pragmatic issues on an everyday basis? Would you fancy to answer this?
That's a great question. Bart, do you want to go first? And I have some thoughts too.
Okay, well, sure, Charles. Well, people do often express and hold very high expectations of international law, that somehow in an ideal world, international law would have the solution for every problem. And we have to be honest about it. I mean, international law is never going to be complete or perfect in a way that the national law of the state might aspire to be. And so there's the problem of educated expectations. And I think, a lot of people, when I tell people I'm a professor of international law, I get this reaction, oh, that's completely bogus. There's no such thing, or that it's completely useless. And I get that attitude a lot because because people are holding international law to an impossible standard. They want to compare it to US constitutional law, which it's never going to be there. And so I think we need to moderate the expectations of international law in order to properly appreciate what can be done. And I think you were implicitly referring to all the international technical cooperation that's going on out there and quietly accomplishing quite a bit. So the high profile issues where international law, well, maybe where it might seem to be most needed, but where it's least capable of affecting the result.
I think, Bart, I think that's absolutely on point. You know, states enter into international agreements when it's in their common interest to do so. And they do. And these agreements stabilize expectations among state parties. And there are so many absolutely robust international agreements, bilateral, multilateral, that work. But I think that Andrea's point of associating international law with crisis really diminishes international law, because international law just, it goes on, and a lot of it is frankly quite dull. It's you know, it's technical.
Sure.
It's, you know, when we're talking about war and peace, I worked in Afghanistan for many years, right? And, you know, so when you look at human rights problems in a crisis country, when you look at the way that particular country is going to potentially disintegrate when the Taliban leave, right? That's when people look and they say, hey, international law doesn't work, right? Because the pressures upon the international legal system are enhanced in conditions of crisis, and crisis is a major condition, just like climate change is a different condition. And climate change is a crisis, maybe not in everyone's perspective, you know. And then there's climate change nationalism too, that Bart and I have
Definitely.
before. Yeah. I just want to say, I saw in the chat our friend and fellow alum Jerry Graham. Hello, Jerry, from Canada. He's in Victoria. Was a student of Professor Cathwish and a great scholar of law of the sea and the Arctic in his own right. And Jerry raises the issue of Russia in the Arctic. So I think we all remember that, you know, Russia made that symbolic planting of the flag below the North Pole, made the cover of Time magazine. You know, every international lawyer in the world, you know, if we were ever asked, would say it's symbolic, it means nothing. But Russia is making serious continental shelf claims, right, by submitting evidence to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. And frankly, in terms of landmass, the largest Arctic countries are Russia, followed by Canada. So Russia is a major player. And what can you do? Russia has icebreakers. Lots of icebreakers, and they have they have more traffic through that route than any other Arctic routes. But I'll stop there.
Let me pick one question for also for Professor Brown. I think the point has been made in the chat that one of the explanations that is possible to give about this you know, increasing trend towards recoiling towards nationalism might be that occasionally nationalism thrives or exploits other kinds of ideologies or postures, be they racial or religious. So in many ways, nationalism becomes some sort of shell within which you know, you can put and squeeze and force different things, but they all together then they generate this worldwide pressure, which pretty much goes against the aspirations that people like us have always dreamt of, you know, to creating the global. And sometimes that, you know, I have that feeling that although we have to put up with global threats, global challenges, we have to provide global administration, perhaps we have failed to create, so far at least, the global citizen.
Well, the global citizen is an ideal and will never be there completely. And I think you're right. I mean, those of us here were almost by definition more in the globalist camp, which is not necessarily popular with you know, the general public. Well, a lot goes to national leadership. I mean, national leadership. When you're a national leader, it's easy to play the nationalist card because you know your nation will have a certain tendency to accept it, regardless of what the rest of the world thinks. And sometimes, of course, it's like wag the dog. You create international tensions to consolidate internal political control, and that happens even in democracies, and that much more in other countries. And so, yeah, nationalism can be a tool of autocratic leaders.
Excellent. Well, I think we have.
There was a quick question in the chat that I'd like to just quickly respond to before we leave, and I know we just have a minute. And it has to do with ice melt and shifting coastlines and so on. And the only thing I will say is that there's a distinction between land ice and sea ice, right, in terms of the effect on a coastline. So the Greenland ice sheet melting, that's going to have a huge effect on coastlines, but the ice that's already in the sea ice will not. So that's just a response to that particular chat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're slowly approaching the end of this most interesting debate. And before I hand it over to Karine and Clementine, whom I'm sure have further announcements to make before we join ourselves for the day, I would like to thank warm-heartedly once again Barton Brown and Charles Norkey for their two excellent presentations and for having caused us to think about things that are most compelling and that are of great interest to whoever believes in the role of international law and contemporary international relations. It's also been a privilege to share the afternoon with you all, alumni of the Graded Institute. I want you to know that I'm not addressing the international lawyers in the audience, as this is one disciplinary panel, that the International Law Department and the Graded Institute will always be your home. So feel free to make contact with us, the faculty, the current faculty, and let's try to work together many, many more times in the upcoming years. But thank you so much for your contributions today. And I'll hand it over to Karine and Clementine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for the moderation of this debate. It was just so good to have you on board. Thank you so much. Thanks to Charles and Bartram for their presentations on this panel. I just want to remind you that tomorrow is day 2, and so the schedule is more or less the same. So 2:15 Geneva time, 8:15 American time. Please subscribe because it's not the same link than today. And we will discuss international trade and development. The debate will be moderated by Richard Baldwin, and we'll discuss also global health security with Suri Moon. I take the opportunity to have the floor to give it back to the president of the Alumni Association, Mrs. Natalie Africa, who just joined us like a minute after 2:30 when she had to introduce. So she will do some closing remarks, and she joins us from South Africa. So Natalie, the floor is yours. It's good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karine. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So good afternoon to everyone. I think really this was just a fantastic use of 2 hours in our afternoon. So much to learn, such excellent speakers and great organization from the Institute and our colleagues. So I really just want to say a few words of thanks and give you a bit of, a few thoughts about this event as well. So, thanks go first, I think, to everyone who participated, alumni, faculty, students, friends of the Institute. I really want to again join Karine in thanking Brian, Stefan, Bertram, and Charles, and our faculty moderators, Cedric and Andrea, for facilitating and speaking in the panels. For me, I just feel it's been really heartwarming to be amongst such a distinguished community and to count the alumni as fellow alumni, and also just feeling this connection that we all still have to the Institute after, for some of us, many years, I also just really enjoyed the multidisciplinary nature of the sessions, and it brought me back to my years studying at the Institute, where we would be exposed to all kinds of things, not just our major, and it's just a fantastic, enlightening learning experience. We really appreciated the support of Marie-Laure Salle, who we heard from earlier, for supporting this event. The genesis of this event came from a conversation with Brian and Paul Mathieu, also a distinguished alumnus who was the former president before me, actually, of the Alumni Association. And they approached us in 2019 with the idea of doing this academic conference that can bring together alumni, faculty, students, you know, recognizing that the normal alumni reunion that we have in the last quarter of the year it coincides with the return to school, and for faculty, so many things that are going on. So it's often difficult for our academic colleagues who are alumni to travel to Geneva during that time. And they said, why don't we do something at a time of the year which is more conducive, which can involve faculty from the Institute as well as students, and you know, that can enable us to also share some of the things we've been working on during the previous academic year. So this was the first experiment. We first planned to do it in person in Geneva, and because of COVID, we didn't do it at all last year, which was the original plan. Then we came back to 2021 and said, let's at least start something, even if it's virtual. And you know, the truth is, we've realized over the last year that there are some advantages to virtual. For example, I'm here in South Africa. I didn't have to travel to Geneva. Virtual does make the world smaller in some ways by bringing us all together. And you know, through all the webinars and things that have happened this year during in the institute, with our chapters, with faculty, with alumni, we've realized we don't want to lose that even post-COVID, right? So we hope to build off this event and others by doing more things that can create this exchange amongst us. We do hope next year the world will be safe enough for us to do this in person. Then we'll also be able to make personal contacts, have coffees across the corridor and so on. And we'll all be looking forward to that. But for now, I just want to again say a special thanks to Brian and Paul for initiating this, to Jason, the Vice President of the Alumni Committee, and Karine and her team for the wonderful high quality work you've put into this. And I also just want to say, for those of you wondering about gender balance, there will be women speakers and so on the session tomorrow. So please, we look forward to seeing most of you come back tomorrow and to enjoy another very high quality afternoon. So thanks, Karine, and thanks to all of you.
Thanks to you, Natalie. And see you tomorrow.
See you all tomorrow.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bon après-midi.
Bye.
Bye.
See you
Bye.
tomorrow.
Thank you,
Take
Bertram.
care.
Yeah.
Thank you, Corinne.
See you.
Natalie.
Yeah, my pleasure.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.